Welcome to Linda's Corner. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about seeing obstacles as opportunities. I'm delighted to welcome special guest Andrew Davie. Andrew is a teacher, writer, podcast host, and a brain aneurysm survivor. You can reach Andrew at his website, andrewdavie.com, and I'll include a link in the description. Welcome, Andrew. I'm so glad that you could join with me today.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be here.
I'm delighted. I'm excited to hear your story. Would you be willing to share, particularly the events that took place in 2018?
Sure, absolutely. So June 23rd of 2018, I had just turned 40. I was teaching at a school, a high school for students with learning disabilities and ADHD. But it was the summer, school was done. I was looking forward to a nice summer break, and I was going to fly the following weekend down to Charleston, South Carolina, to visit my parents. So that morning, Saturday morning, the 29th, I got to the airport. I felt fine. When I got to my gate, I started to sweat like I had just run a marathon. So at the time, I remember thinking, this is strange, but maybe I'm just coming down with a cold or a flu. I didn't really think much of it. And then when they called my group number to board and I lifted my bag, it felt like there were cinder blocks in there. So that was another red flag that I disregarded at the time, thinking, well, maybe I'm coming down with something, but it'll be fine. As long as I can get on the plane, maybe I'll take a nap. And then I scanned my ticket and tried to walk on the plane, and the floor started to shift, like I was in a fun house at a carnival. And I still wasn't really thinking that anything was wrong, which I now attribute to the aneurysm that I was having at the time. But I remember thinking, I just need to get enough momentum so that I can get onto the plane. And I took a step forward and fell down on the jetway. So thankfully, I didn't board the plane. And because it was at the airport early in the morning, there were first responders who got to me very quickly. And I remember someone put a neck brace on and said, "Don't move." And then I don't remember anything after that. Thankfully, they took me to the hospital. I went to George Washington University Hospital, right outside of Washington, D.C., which is what I learned later, a great trauma center. So it was almost as if all of the dominoes had lined up perfectly in order for me to survive a ruptured brain aneurysm that essentially came out of nowhere. There were no symptoms, no signs other than the immediate, sweating and the bag being heavy.
That's
But
Man,
yeah,
like you said, as the domino pieces are just coming into place, as you're talking about being in the airport and trying to get on, I'm thinking, did he get on the plane? Did they have to divert? How did and so the fact that things took place when they did and where they did. Do you live alone? I mean, if you had been at home,
I do know. I mean, 95% of the scenarios don't end well. I happen to be in a public place, in front of people. So, all of those things factored into the fact that I was able to make it. And I think, unfortunately, the mortality rates aren't very good to having a ruptured brain aneurysm anyway. And I happen to be, in the top 99th percentile of, being in the right place, surviving what I had, and coming out of it really. I'm really fortunate that any of the limitations I have right now are very minor. My vision is still, it still takes time to settle. If I turn my head, I like to think of it, I'm sort of like a human bobblehead. It takes a minute to, and my balance still isn't very good, but I've come to learn that those are more of like a nuisance problems rather than I still participate in a lot of support groups for people who've recovered from brain injuries. And so many people have difficulty with their memory or processing, or it precludes them from being able to work or do anything um, that resembles their old life to the point where it's a real letdown. But I'm fortunate enough that I could go back to school. I could teach. I could continue to write. I could do all of these things. And so yeah. So I mean, really, at the end of the day, I'm fortunate in so many ways that I keep learning about. A few years later. So it's been a very strange uh, and surreal recovery on its own. And then, just as I was starting to adjust, that's when the COVID pandemic really took over. So it became a very personal experience that was sort of difficult to articulate into a universal experience where everyone sort of understands the magnitude of what we're all going through. So it's been my 40s have been a very strange time.
That is an interesting thing that you brought up about COVID is it's given the whole world a shared experience. And I love that you talk about the positives and those tender mercies that took place in your experience. I know many people who, if they had gone through your experience, would only have focused on the negative. So what a beautiful thing that you're able to recognize the positive. And I applaud you for that. I think that's beautiful. So what was the recovery process like? And you talked about being in support groups. How do you help each other?
Well, the for me, the physical recovery happened within the first year. Most of it at the beginning, when I was discharged from the hospital, I had double vision, so I wore an eye patch, and I needed a cane and a guard belt to walk. And I usually could only go about 40 seconds before I would need to take a break. Um,
1 second. What's a guard belt?
Guard, so it's sort of like an airplane seatbelt that goes around your waist, and then someone can hold on to the end of it as you're walking in case you falter. They can catch you or right you.
Okay, so
Um,
you're not by yourself. You have a support walking.
yeah, when I was in the hospital, when I first got out, my mother actually stayed in my apartment with me to help drive me to various appointments, or as I was doing physical therapy, she would be there to monitor. So yeah, so the first I wasn't so I currently live, and I had lived on my own. Um, when I got out of the hospital, for the first few months, my mother either lived with me in the apartment, or I moved eventually back into my parents' house, because I wouldn't have been able to do everything on my own quite yet.
Marvelous that you have a great support system. If you didn't have that, you would probably be in a rehab facility for all of that amount of time.
Yes, I mean, I am fortunate that I had a lot of friends and family who were very supportive and understanding, and that allowed me to heal at a great pace. Um, and I had opportunities. I would say the first year was mostly focused on physical recovery, which happened within the first 9 months. I would say I didn't need the cane anymore to walk, and eventually my double vision went away.
Oh, good.
Um, what I didn't really know or anticipate was that I would have an emotional adjustment that would take a lot longer and be a little bit more difficult to quantify, because there aren't as many indications you're making progress. Um, with the cane, at least I was able to put that down eventually, so that was a significant sign that, well, you're getting better with walking. But there really weren't many of those indications with emotional recovery. Um, but going back to what you had said in terms of finding the sort of the silver linings, or the positive elements. I feel like so many things that look like they're going to be uncomfortable or difficult end up becoming fulfilling or enjoyable over time. Um, like, for example, I was going to go back to teaching as a tutor full time. That job got canceled because of COVID. So I moved back in with my parents for about a year. And it was during that time I realized that I probably wouldn't be fulfilled going back to teaching full time. And I should probably pursue a different career. So I'm going to begin a clinical mental health counseling program to get my degree in that starting in January, because I feel like that would be something that would be more motivating to pursue, and I could use my insight to help other people. But I wouldn't have been able to make that conclusion had COVID not happened and sort of given me the opportunity to only focus on thinking about the future. So so
Yes.
there are a lot of things that at the time might seem like they're difficult or bad, but over time, the perspective shifts and enough time goes by and they begin to change. So I feel like there's so many of those opportunities that we're unaware of until something really good or really bad happens, and we're sort of forced to consider the different alternatives. But for me, I had a traumatic event happen a few years ago that I think about pretty frequently, and I try to make the best of, the situation. And some days that's easier to do. Other days it's not as easy. But I feel like everybody is in that position. Even if you haven't had a brain injury, there are still obstacles you have, difficulties you have each day, and sometimes it just takes time to to get the right perspective.
Absolutely. We all have different life experiences, but somehow the feelings and the emotions that we have are very similar and relatable. So that dealing with something that's difficult, whether it's A, B, C, X, Y, Z, we still have to work our way through it and look for the positive and see if we can turn that into something good where we can learn from it, grow from it, and pay it forward. And it seems like you have developed a passion, something that really matters to you and is fulfilling, which is fantastic. I think that that's great. Let's talk a little bit more about your counseling. What do you envision? How do you plan to help the next people who are on this path of life, who are behind you, to help them to be able to catch up and progress in their lives?
Well, I think one, aside from people who were professionals that helped, either various therapy I'd had to deal with physical recovery or emotional recovery, what ended up helping me a lot during some days was just confirmation from somebody that what I was experiencing wasn't unique to me, or that I shouldn't feel alone, because so many other people who've had ruptured brain aneurysms have also experienced X. And just hearing that made me feel a lot better. Even though it didn't really solve any problem, it was just, it stopped being magnified more.
That you're not alone. And if that isn't that just a universal message that we all need to hear, you're not alone.
Yeah, so that's I mean that's my I that's what I hope to bring to counseling people, is just if I can allow them to feel less alone in what they're going through. That's really what and I kind of feel like I have good insight into a certain form of recovery, or getting through difficult moments, um, with a traumatic brain injury.
A
So if I can,
form of recovery. What help me understand what that means?
I'm sorry, could you say, we sort of cut off?
A certain form of recovery. Will you?
Oh yeah, I mean I'm recovering from a ruptured brain aneurysm, which I would imagine would be different than recovering from any other sort of illness.
Okay.
Or
So your counseling is going to include all kinds of people, not just brain injury. Is that correct?
I,
Or
I think so. Yeah, I mean I haven't really decided yet, nor do I know if that's really an option. I would like to be able to help anyone who needs it. So I think I have more insight into people recovering from brain injuries since that's what I had. Um,
Yeah, for
so
sure. You have some insight in that one. So are you going to be like a licensed professional counselor kind of a thing with a
yeah,
therapy? Okay,
yeah,
that's what I'm getting. Okay.
that would be the and I'm not sure, what group of people I will end up counseling, but I'm just hoping to be helpful to anyone who really needs to feel like they're making progress or they're less alone with whatever they're dealing with.
So is that your main message? You're not alone and you're making progress. Is that kind of the
I
feeling?
think so. Yeah, I think that along with the, recovery of any sort is never a straight line. It's always in spirals or circles. So there are days where you feel like you're not making any progress, but in the grand scheme of things, you are, even if you only move forward a couple of inches, it's difficult to keep that perspective. That's another thing that support groups end up doing well. Is just people can sort of tell you that they've noticed progress you've made, even if you haven't seen it because you're so close to it.
Right.
So it's great to. I've found that it's hard to be objective with yourself, and to sort of take note of progress you've made or steps you've taken or any sort of benefit like that. I think a lot of the time you need somebody else.
On the
So
side to recognize and say, hey, before you were at this point and now you're at this point. There are a couple things we can do as far as writing things down. This is where I was and this is where I am. But I think you're right. Having an extra pair of eyes is so helpful. I had a thought about your comment about feeling like, you're kind of going down or spiral or whatever. If you take like the wave, we always feel like life goes in ups and downs. And if we turn that up on an angle, it actually is stairs. So even though we feel like we're going down, we don't have to necessarily be going down. It can still be part of our progress. And that I think is sometimes helpful to remember because we don't go in a straight line. It does seem to move around up and down and side to side and circles and up and down and whatever. And all of those directions still can get us in a good place.
definitely. I think the other thing is before the aneurysm, I'd had certain life goals that I think after the aneurysm, I kept trying to focus on, even though they weren't as much of a priority anymore. Like, for example, I had always thought that I would settle down and start a family, perhaps. Like, that would be the. So, at one point after the aneurysm, I began online dating again. And I remember I focused so much on should I bring up that I had a ruptured brain aneurysm during our first date? And if I do, when do I bring, it just became this whole thing where that became the focus rather than do I really want to be out right now with this person? Am I enjoying myself? The things that should matter had taken sort of, and that's when I realized that, what, I may meet somebody at some point, and that's great. I may not. At this point, it's not as much of a priority as it was. So there are certain of goals like that I've sort of that I kept trying to keep at the top of the list, and then eventually I realized, what, these are still worthwhile goals, but maybe they shouldn't be at the top. Um, whereas,
Also be that timing issue that you mentioned.
sure,
Well,
sure,
right now the brain aneurysm and that experience, which is always going to be a huge factor in your life, but it was like right in front of your face and you couldn't even see anybody really to date. It was just like, I am the brain aneurysm. And you're not. You are Andrew. You know what I mean? There's
Hmm.
more to you than that experience, but that is definitely a defining experience. So,
I think it just took time. Again, that was the, I was fortunate that the silver lining for me during COVID was that I could move back in with my parents, and take the time to fully keep healing and not have to worry so much about any other obligations. So that allowed me a lot of time to reflect and think about things and make decisions based on what I truly wanted to do as opposed to what I felt I should do, which I feel like a lot of people get caught up in the idea of, well, I think this is what's expected of me, so I'm going to do this, and it's not something they truly want to do. So then they end up having trouble later on. So I was lucky in that I've sort of gotten a chance to have a clean slate and start over, and I'm going to try to make the most of that situation. The I wrote a memoir last year, which deals partially with the recovery, and I'm working on a follow up to that, which which will sort of deal less with the traumatic incident and more with just what's happened afterward, and the changes, because I feel like everyone goes through, everyone has traumatic experiences in their life, and I've heard fewer stories of the follow up, the next couple of years afterward, which I'm discovering can be just as difficult in different ways.
ooh,
So
expound on that a little bit because I think that point is huge. I think a lot of times we have this idea that life is a little bit like a movie. And once you've reached that climax and you hit the denouement, all of a sudden, we live happily ever after. And real life doesn't seem to work that way. It just doesn't.
no, I think what helped me a lot was that in the beginning of my recovery, I had a lot of expectations for how it might go, and they were never met. So, right, I assumed that my ability to walk without a cane came back in 9 months. So my vision should probably come back in 9 months, and I will feel like how I used to feel. In my personality will be the same. It'll just take, a year. And what I discovered was that I there would be elements of my former life before the aneurysm that I would experience again. I would live in the same apartment still. Friends of mine that I had before would still be my friends now, but there were a lot of elements that would be different, um, with regard to just how I felt about certain things, um, how much sleep I would need. So major or minor things would change. Um, and it was getting comfortable with that. I think that was the big sort of thing. But what I also realized was that so much, I think, like you had said, you have the climax. There's the rising actions, the climax, and then we just think you're going to ride off into the sunset happily ever after. But that happily ever after ride to the sunset could take a really long time and go in directions you're not prepared for. So I think I've really become comfortable with uncertainty.
Hmm.
That I sort of know the direction that I'm heading in, but I don't know the exact course. And I think it took a while to feel comfortable, like, well, we'll figure it out. There's no need to worry about what's in that direction, because if it's trouble, you'll deal with it. And if it's enjoyable, you'll enjoy it. And if you're just going to think about it right now, then that's wasting time, that you don't really have, that you're losing by not enjoying the present moment.
Excellent. So, would your advice then to someone who has experienced a trauma be to be flexible? and to just enjoy the moment? I mean, what would be some words of wisdom?
Yeah, I would say um, be open to how the recovery is going to go. Um, Obviously, we all have expectations, but just recognize that it's probably going to be different than what you expect, and that it's not going to happen in a straight line. And I would just say to give it a lot of time. I was in a virtual support group the other day where someone had mentioned that he didn't really start feeling comfortable until 4 or 5 years after his incident.
What does comfortable mean?
I think adjusted to the new, living a new life, or life 2.0, or whatever, however you'd want to categorize that. But I think just not worrying all the time about everything, or being so hyper vigilant if something goes wrong. I think it took him a few years to just feel, you know what, I'm okay. I've adjusted to a point where I feel comfortable now and I'm not worried all the time. And I think that was really comforting for me to hear, because I'm approaching the 4 year mark myself, and I'm just beginning to feel sort of relaxed and capable, I guess that would be a good way to, capable to address the future, if it's going to be difficult, if it's going to be easy. Um, these are things I now feel less overwhelmed by. I don't. I don't. There was a time where I just wanted to focus on the next 24 hours, because thinking what might happen a month from now, where might I be, what might I be doing, was a little too overwhelming.
What a
Um,
clever thing to do. If the whole picture seems too overwhelming, then let's shrink it down into a manageable bite-sized chunk. Like I can get through today. Or if that's too much, I can get through this hour or however long. I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, that was really help, especially during COVID, when things in the beginning, when things were very much no, crazy, and no one really knew how it was going to play out. It was much easier to just think, well, let's not think about what's going to happen next year, because that's so far in the future, and really who knows. But let's think about, what am I going to have for breakfast tomorrow? Something that's within my control, that's, like you'd said, it's a manageable thing. It's easy to digest. And then over time, I was able to, make it 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Well, what's next week going to be like? Okay, this is not overwhelming to think about anymore. But that took time, to get to. And I think that would be another thing I would offer, is to just be open to the fact that it may take longer than you think for you to feel comfortable and adjusted to the point where you're not worried or concerned so much about everything.
I like the idea of being compassionate with yourself, that it's okay. I don't have to meet some prior expectations or even anyone else's expectations. It's okay to allow the process and to take the time. And I think that's very helpful. I also really appreciated your connection and correlation to your experience to the world's experience with COVID, and how that put everybody in a state of upheaval where you don't know what's going to happen. Everything changed. Our routines changed. Kids going to school, their routine changed. I mean, everything just changed. And I think hopefully we learn that things can be okay, even if we don't know what okay is going to look like. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it is recognizing that I may not be able to articulate what tomorrow looks like. I may not be able to describe it, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be bad. It may, it's going to be surprising. I think one of my therapists had suggested going into each day with a curiosity.
I like
That's
that.
sort of, you're excited about what the possibility may have. Um, you don't need to know what it's going to be. And I've tried to adopt that with pretty much everything. Just keep sort of a healthy curiosity about, let's see what this experience is like. Before we make up our mind about it, let's give it a chance and see. And I feel much more capable now of dealing with, if it's going to be, difficult or adversity. I feel like, well, I've dealt with a bunch of adversity in the past couple of years, either personally or universally. So I feel like whatever happens, I will be able to handle it. And if it's great, I have a more of an appreciation now to enjoy it. Um, so it's been something where I've chosen to allow this experience to, to mold me into a certain type of person who appreciates things more. I feel like it very easily I could have become very jaded about everything. Um, but that's within our control, is to choose how we're going to. It's one of the few things that we have total control over, is we choose how we're going to allow something to make us feel. Um, I mean, obviously we can't choose how emotionally we're going to react, but we can decide, well, I'm going to indulge this, or I'm not going to let this, ruin whatever is going on.
Like Viktor Frankl's in Man's Search for Meaning, where we can handle any how if we have a why, that we have a choice to be able to respond to our things. Another thing that I loved in as you were talking is you said the word become. And I think you are becoming something new. You're not just doing something new, you are becoming something new. And I think that's greater and deeper than just doing. It is changing you on the inside, not just in your brain as things are healing, but in who you are. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. I'm so glad you brought up Viktor Frankl, because I read that book last year for the second time, but the second time really had a profound impact on me, because that's where the sort of aha moment was, where he talked about how you can find joy in any moment, no matter what the parameters are. And that really was something that resonated with me as, oh, okay, here's a person who's been in, the worst possible experience you could ever imagine, and yet he's still able to find joy. I will be able to find joy in something that I may not be aware of right now, but it's out there. And if I just allow it to find me, it will. Um,
And you being curious is going to help you to find it.
sure,
I think that's a beautiful thing.
I would definitely agree with you.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing your insight. I am so glad that you survived, and I'm glad that you have a purpose and a direction to be able to pay it forward and to be able to help other people. And thank you so much for visiting with me today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
That's been a pleasure. In closing, I'd like to share a quote by author Roy Bennett. He said, "Turn your obstacles into opportunities and your problems into possibilities." If you've experienced obstacles and problems in your life, I invite you to search for ways to turn them into opportunities and possibilities. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Linda's Corner, please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. I also invite you to check out my nonprofit, Hope for Healing, at the website hopeforhealingfoundation.org for free ebooks, free audiobooks, and other free resources to help increase happiness, build confidence and self-esteem, strengthen relationships, manage stress, and calm feelings of depression and anxiety. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, or Amazon bestseller, You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.